Welcome to the Falling Walls Breakthrough Conversations. We have created a safe and quiet space for conversations with global leaders, outstanding scientists, emerging innovators, and science entrepreneurs. We'll be looking at their research, their career paths, and just their personal experiences. The digital audience is also able to take part. I'll let you know how you can do that in just 1 second. But before we get to that, I'll introduce myself. I am Adam Levy. I'm a science journalist and communicator, and I'll be conducting this interview. So one of the special things about Falling Walls Conversations is that you can ask your questions as well. If you have a question while you're watching our conversation, just raise your hand digitally using the Zoom function. You'll then be spotlighted, unmuted, and then you can ask your question. After your question, you'll be muted again and sent back to the crowd. So if you have a follow-up question, just raise your hand again and we'll go through the whole process again. If you have any technical questions, though, just feel free to drop them in the chat. You don't need to be unmuted and speak to us to clear those up. The conversation is being recorded and will be available in the online library after the Falling Walls Summit is completed. So that's all the admin out of the way. Let's turn now to the actual conversation we have today. We are joined now by Dilip Menon, the Malone Chair in Indian Studies at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Hello, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Adam, for having me.
Now, Dilip is looking at ideas to take us beyond the nation state and beyond this simplistic post- and pre-colonial binary. Now, I think we should start by breaking down what some of those terms mean. Okay. I guess most people have some sense of what a nation means and what a state means, but what do we really mean when we say a nation state?
Right, at a very basic level, the idea of the nation rests in the imagination, that an imagined community, as Benedict Anderson once put it. When we think about the state, it's an institutional form. But when we talk about the nation state, we must also remember that it's a very recent phenomenon, that prior to the nation state, we didn't have borders, we didn't have passports. There was the fluid movement of people across the globe, creating their own geographies through their movements, geographies of affinity. Right, where you moved to and met people whom you wanted to, whether you're a revolutionary or a romantic. And with the development of nation states and bureaucratic forms, what you have is controls, where you make a distinction between citizens, non-citizens, citizens, migrants, citizens, refugees. And the foundational idea of the nation state is policing borders within which a category called citizens are contained, making nations non-porous entities. So that's really what I'm trying to think against.
Now, you mentioned this is a recent idea. Yes. How recent are we actually talking? When did this idea, as we're talking about it, come into play?
Well, if you think about the European states, they have come into existence from the 18th century onwards, and in our parts of the world, as a result of colonialism. In Asia and Africa, nations are emerging as late as the 70s. So Algeria is the 1960s, Mozambique and Angola in the 1970s, as Lusophone and Francophone colonialism come to an end. So it's a fairly recent phenomenon, which is why I think there is this tense structure as nations try to create who they are, imagine who they are, and do it through policing borders and containing citizens.
Now, I guess you've already alluded to this, but you follow the idea that the concept of the nation state is limited, or perhaps even more than limited, actually harmful.
Yes.
Can you explain what the harms of the nation state are?
See, one of the ways in which, if you have a space which is founded on exclusion, because remember, a nation state is founded on exclusion, who does not belong. The South African Freedom Charter says South Africa belongs to all who live in it. It's an expansive and hospitable idea. Think again 2015, right? 6 years ago, when these Syrian migrants crossed the Mediterranean. Most of them didn't know how to swim. Most of them had seen the ocean for the first time. And they land up at the borders of Germany, and there is a hospitality that welcomes them. So alongside the miracle of their walking on water to get here, you have the miracle of German warmth and hospitality. Right? They weren't told, well, some perhaps were, but they weren't told that, look, you're not Germans, that you're not citizens here. And I hope for a world in which there is the free movement of people possible, that one responds as a human to the call of another human for succor, help. And so that is really at the heart of my thinking here.
I'd like to come back to your particular approach on the nation state in just 1 second, but you mentioned there some of the similarities and maybe differences between the South African and German approaches. Right. How global is this concept of the nation state? Are there, I was going to say, are there countries, which is maybe going to be a bit of a contradiction, but are there countries where the idea of a nation state really breaks down and it's not treated in the same way that we feel it does maybe in Europe or in North America?
Right. I mean, if you think about this as an idea, then we're thinking about a process. So the nation state is not an achieved entity. There are new nations coming into existence, right, even as we speak. So there are around 200-odd nations in existence, and there are movements for secession, movements for separation. We're seeing what's happening in Ethiopia and places like that. So I think the important thing to think about is, why are people so invested in this form, and what form does the nation take? And that is where some of the troubles that I'm pointing to come up. That when you create a nation state, apart from creating a notion of exclusion, citizenship, and borders, and so on, what it really means is that within any nation there is a certain group or a certain elite that rules. And very often it speaks the rhetoric of equality, it speaks the rhetoric of a break from the past, but very often what you have are the continuities of hierarchies, the continuities of imposition of certain forms of subjection on people. So those, again, are some of the themes that I think one needs to think about, right?
I promise we will get on to your approach to this, but every answer you give inspires another one. How is that unique in South Africa? Because obviously the points you just raised are so fresh in the minds of anyone who understands South African history and the history of apartheid.
Right. See, one of the important things to understand is that we tend to understand territory as that within which people move. But actually people create territory as they move. So a lot of the history of Africa is the constant movement of people through fairly permeable borders. Then you have the Conference of Berlin, right? And you have the drawing of lines in the dust, which are policed lines. And if you look at the borders of most of the maps of countries in Africa, they're straight lines. Right? You know, it's the most rational division possible. But what it does is that it draws lines through people's imaginations, it draws lines through people's hearts, and it draws lines through the possibilities of movements that created the continent as it is. I mean, as you know, in South Africa, most of the black population speak multiple languages. They come from multiple places. Right? And so the idea of the South African citizen is a very muddied idea. Right? It consists of the vast histories of migration. So lines in the dust, shadow lines, as Amitav Ghosh called them, are attempts, they reflect the hubris of states. Right? You try to contain people's lives, but people like water flow.
Now, let's come to your ideas to move beyond these limitations, beyond these borders, and beyond this narrow concept of the nation state. What do you propose is a way out of this?
There are three things, perhaps. The first is that there is a way in which our understanding is governed by the idea of the colonial and the idea of the modernity, which is the obscure object of our desire. We all desire to be like Europe, coming from spaces in Asia and Africa and so on. And then as a rebellion against this, as a resistance to this, you have something called post-colonial theory, and which creates a division between the pre-colonial, the colonial, and the post-colonial. But central to that is the colonial hinge, that abbreviated time, right? Because if you think about the histories of most of our spaces, it extends before colonialism and extends beyond colonialism. So how do we begin to think with imaginations that cannot be contained by the colonial? So that's the first question, which is my idea of the para-colonial, that there are many times, many imaginations that exist alongside the colonial, precede the colonial, and go on beyond the colonial. The second is to think beyond the hubris of the terrestrial. Most nation states are based on an idea of territory and of borders and so on. What purchase on human life and human history do we have if we think with water? So if we think about maps of migration, when the 40,000 years ago, when the first anatomically modern human beings made their way out of Africa, they traveled across land and water and went to Polynesia, Australia, and so on. But if you get onto the net and you look at maps of contemporary migrations, they follow more or less exactly the same routes, right? You could map one onto the other. So there's something there about bringing water in which allows us to see another history, which is not the history that is inscribed by states about themselves, inscribed by the elites in societies about themselves, and so on. That's the second thing, thinking with water. The third thing is, again, to proceed with the idea of water, that we are all in the same predicament now. We are standing up to our necks in water. And the South African photographer Gideon Mendel photographs people in their homes with water up to their necks in places as far apart as Australia and Bangladesh. There is no difference between the first world and the third world, global north, global south. To be polemical and to be demotic, we're all in the same shit, or we are all in the same water, right? So then the question is, why is it that the social sciences can't begin to think with water? Because that is not at the edge of our imagination, it's lapping at our feet right now.
How important do you feel, or do you hope these ideas could be when it comes to, for example, the negotiations which are taking place as we speak in Glasgow, the climate negotiations, COP26?
Right. I mean, these negotiations are happening between nation states. They're happening in a field of international relations where the political economy determines that some nations are more powerful than the others, that some nations can ignore the protocols, right? So the United States can choose to do something or not do something, as in the case of they're not subscribing to the International Court for Justice, for example. So that's not where hope lies for me. Hope lies for me in the kind of grassroots small movements that happen, the perception of people who, some of these winners of these Falling Walls Awards, who are working with things like recycling, working with micro issues, and those are the things that will then permeate a consciousness, right? I mean, and one of the things about the Falling Walls is that I feel tremendously humbled when somebody who develops the vaccine, COVID vaccine, gets an award. Somebody who's restoring sight to people gets an award, and I think, where do I belong in this? And I think the social sciences and the humanities allow people to imagine a world differently, to imagine another world. And that's really where I see the strength of this lies. COP will put into place some regulations, hopefully.
Now, I'd just like to remind the audience that I'm not necessarily the only one asking questions. If you have a question of your own, please just go ahead and raise your hand. And I think we actually have one now. I've seen one highlighted on the screen. So please introduce yourself and let's hear what you have to ask.
Hello, my name is Stepan. Thank you so much for the conversation. It's been very inspirational conversation for me. I really support your idea of unity and the idea when the countries should unite over some global challenges. But the thing is that I have a feeling that a lot of countries have this idea of national identity, which is very strong. And for example, for myself, coming from Russia, we have this idea of the unique path of our country and all of that. How do you think that might be addressed in future? How Russia, for example, can be included in this global conversation? Maybe it's a bad way to go through politicians, and maybe we should somehow address and target the people themselves.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, it'd be great to have an answer, both in the general case and if you have any thoughts on Russia specifically.
Thanks, Stepan, for that question. And I think, when you think about Russia, Russia is a young nation. It's after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 that you have these independent nations emerging. But just to answer your point by going back in history, one of the things that happens in India, and when India is a colonized space, in 1905, there's a big attempt at rebelling politically against the British colonial government. It's brought down very severely, and then there's a huge diaspora that emerges from that as political activists go into exile in places as far apart from Japan to Brazil. A lot of them come to Germany, and they're learning languages, making friends, and those geographies of affinity are what actually created the imagination of a new world. It's from those group of people who went around the world and made friendships as far apart as, far away from India as Mexico, that an imagination of what equality could be, what friendship could be, what hospitality could be emerged. So the emergence of the nation state, when India becomes independent in 1947, there's a myopia that results, as a lot of these connections are excised, and the idea of the Indian is somebody who lives in India, rather than the idea of the Indian as being somebody who carries both body and mind into other spaces and connections. And I think the same with Russia too. I was brought up in India I grew up in India in the 1970s, but the Soviet Union was a part of my imagination. And for me, when Stepan talks to me, I think, that's a long-lost brother talking to me, right? And so I'm old enough to remember that geography. And I think that's the way to go. These geographies of affinity will continue to exist and rebel against the attempts to police borders.
We've spoken about your academic ambitions, the ambitions of these ideas, but when someone talks about rewriting social science, as I believe you have spoken about, right, I imagine that's something not all social scientists welcome with open arms. Have you met resistance to these ideas?
I shouldn't put myself forward as a kind of lone crusader, Don Quixote-like. I think in the social sciences and humanities, as in any other intellectual or political venture, you attempt to create a community, and you're part of a community of conversation. You're part of a community of hope. You're part of a community of dialogue. So a lot of the work that I do does not originate with me. It originates with multiple conversations, workshops that have been held across the global South. And I think the resistance that may comes from not only the demands of disciplines, that history has these protocols and so philosophy has these protocols, it also comes from the fact that a lot of people are resistant to the idea of reading widely, right? So if you are in Europe, that you read European literature, if you're in India, that you read Indian literature, but it's a question of creating that geography of affinity, right, where I seek my companionship with people in Ecuador, in Russia, in Colombia, in Mongolia, because there are people who are working with certain ideas which resonate with me, right? And that's really should be the foundation of social sciences, rather thinking again with the idea of nation as imagination, state as institution. Knowledge is something that is without borders. But universities create the borders. So the universities are institutions that police knowledge just as much as states are institutions that police belonging in a nation.
You mentioned extensive collaboration with others in the global South.
Yeah.
Do you feel there is, to some extent, a divide between the academic thought in this area, between the global South and maybe the stalwarts of the nation state, for example, in Europe and North America?
I certainly believe that thought proceeds from a location. To think from Princeton is not the same as thinking from Addis Ababa, right? I mean, to put it very simply. In South Africa, we have had, since 2016, with the fees must fall, the decolonized knowledge, students have said, we want a certain kind of university. What you're teaching us doesn't serve our purposes. It belongs to, you're teaching us histories and knowledge that come from elsewhere. So the university has had to rethink what it teaches. It has had to upend its old pedagogical project. And I don't think that happens in most universities in the global North. I mean, you go there as a supplicant. You go to get what the university gives you. You can't go to the university and demand that you be taught what you want to learn. And I think that has to be the basis of any pedagogy. And that is the distinction between the global South and the global North. To put it crudely, I mean, you know that there isn't a line around the world, you know. So, but I think apart from all of this, to go back to something I said earlier, considering that we are standing in water up to our necks, these ideas also make very little sense of global north, global south. We need to have these trans-hemispheric conversations because the world is what we are likely to lose. Right?
And is that, I mean, a part of why you're here? Are you hoping to create those conversations more actively in countries like Germany?
No, I mean, that would be to overestimate the impact of my work and of my charisma and personality such as they are. But certainly I'm having conversations, a number of conversations with people here whom I hope to stay in touch with whom some of these arguments strike a chord. A lot of what they say to me strikes a chord. And in fact, the work that I've done over the last 10 years have been based on conversations that have happened in Beirut, in Cairo, in Johannesburg, and places with intellectuals in China, intellectuals in Brazil and Argentina. So most of whom I haven't met. I'm an inveterate Facebook person. So a lot of my intellectual work is done on Facebook, and making friends and influencing people. So I think there are multiple ways of carrying on conversations. One doesn't necessarily need to expend carbon miles and travel halfway around the globe. But the desire to communicate, the desire to talk is central.
I don't think I've come across a Facebook academic in this way before.
Well, my publications are not only on Facebook, unless you go away with
Facebook posts. No. Okay, good. That's reassuring. I think we're almost out of time, but I suppose, is there a message that you would want to deliver, a kind of core idea about what we can hope to achieve when we move beyond the nation state and what the world could look like if we were able to make that transition?
Right. I mean, I knew this was coming, this idea of the millenarian messiah with a message. But I think the English author E.M. Forster had a phrase which is resonant. It's a resonant phrase. It says, only connect. And I think that's been my methodology, that I need to connect with people with whom I share affinities across the globe. And language is no barrier. The desire to speak transcends language. The desire to connect transcends language.
I think we're not going to find a better point to end on than that. So thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Our next conversation is in just 5 minutes, so do stay tuned for that. It will be with Michel Lamont. So thank you so much for joining us once again, and thank you to our audience.
Thanks, Adam.